Can you stay late tonight? You didn't check your calendar. You didn't think about how tired you already were. You didn't ask how late. You just said, yeah, that's fine. The conversation moved on. The moment passed. But later, driving home, you replay it. You weren't threatened. You weren't pressured. No one raised their voice. So why did it feel like there was never really a choice? We like to believe persuasion is loud, aggressive, obvious. In reality, the most effective influence feels quiet, almost polite. The mistake people keep making is watching what is said instead of noticing what is triggered. Because nothing convinced you. No argument was made. No logic was exchanged. Something else activated, and the decision followed automatically. By the end of this, you'll understand why the most powerful influence doesn't persuade. It activates. Moments like that don't just happen at work. They happen with friends, with family, with money. You agree to things you didn't plan to agree to. You comply faster than you expected. And afterward, you explain the decision as if it was intentional. Most people assume this happens because they're too nice, or conflict avoidant, or not assertive enough. That explanation feels comforting. It's also wrong. The real reason is more precise and more unsettling, because the same mechanism that made that yes feel natural is the same one that quietly shapes how you spend, who you listen to, and where your leverage slowly disappears. And the biggest mistake people make is thinking this only works on other people. The framework you're about to see comes from Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. Not written by a marketer, not written by a motivational speaker, but by a behavioral psychologist who spent years studying salespeople, fundraisers, recruiters, advertisers, people whose survival depended on getting others to say yes. What Cialdini discovered wasn't a list of tricks. It was something more structural. He found that most persuasion doesn't rely on argument at all. It relies on automatic responses that activate before conscious reasoning kicks in. That's why smart, disciplined people still fall for it. And why knowing better often isn't enough. The mental map. Think of the mind like this. When life moves slowly, you decide. When life speeds up, your brain switches modes. Instead of analyzing everything, it relies on a small set of shortcuts, rules that usually work well enough to keep you functioning. Cialdini called these shortcuts weapons of influence, not because they're evil, but because once activated, they produce compliance automatically. No debate, no resistance, just action. And once you see them, you'll recognize why that moment with your boss felt decided before you ever spoke. Idea 1, Automaticity. Why your brain hands decisions off. Before we talk about influence, we have to talk about how decisions are actually made. Not ideally, not rationally, but realistically. Most of the time, you are not choosing. You are responding. When life moves slowly, you can afford to think. But most decisions don't happen in slow conditions. They happen mid-conversation under time pressure while multitasking when social expectations are present. In those moments, your brain switches modes. Instead of evaluating the whole situation, it looks for a single meaningful cue, something that has worked before, and lets that cue decide. This is called automaticity, not a flaw, a survival feature. People assume automatic behavior means careless behavior. It doesn't. In fact, automatic responses exist because they're usually efficient. The mistake is believing that important decisions are exempt from this system. They're not. The more complex the situation, the more likely your mind will rely on shortcuts. Your brain is constantly managing overload, so it asks a simpler question than, what is the best decision? It asks, what signal here has guided me correctly before? That signal becomes the trigger feature. Once it appears, the response follows, quickly, confidently, and without conscious debate. There's a story often told about a jewelry store that couldn't sell a particular item. The pieces were ignored. No interest, no buyers. Then by mistake, the price was increased. Sales jumped. Nothing about the product changed, only the signal. Expensive activated a shortcut. Expensive equals valuable. The decision wasn't analyzed. It was triggered. And here's the uncomfortable part. The customers weren't foolish. They were human. Once a shortcut is activated, the decision feels self-generated. You don't feel controlled. You feel reasonable. That's why people defend these decisions afterward. Not because they're stubborn, but because the mind prefers coherence over correction. It wants the story to make sense. Think back to the last time you agreed quickly. What was the one cue your brain locked onto? This is the part most people misunderstand. Automaticity alone doesn't explain persuasion. It only explains how the door opens. The real power comes from knowing which cues reliably trigger compliance. And there are only a few. The next one is the oldest and the hardest to resist. Idea 2. Reciprocation. Why a small favor creates a large pull. Most people think obligation comes from agreement. It doesn't. It comes from receiving. When someone gives you something, a favor, help, time, attention, your mind marks a balance. Not logically, socially. And that balance feels unfinished until you give something back. This happens even when you didn't ask, you didn't want it, you didn't need it. The rule activates automatically. If someone gives, I should return. People assume reciprocation only works when the exchange is fair. It doesn't. The size of the first favor is irrelevant. What matters is that something was received. Once that happens, saying no later doesn't feel neutral. It feels like taking. Reciprocation is enforced socially, but experienced internally. Your mind isn't calculating value. It's avoiding discomfort. The discomfort of appearing ungrateful, violating social norms, damaging your self-image. So when a request follows a favor, the request feels heavier than it actually is. Not because it's reasonable, but because refusing it feels wrong. Think about a coworker who helps you with something small. They stay a few minutes late. They have your back in a meeting. They share information you didn't ask for. Nothing is demanded. Then later, hey, could you cover this for me? Can you handle this one thing? The request isn't big, but saying no suddenly feels awkward, not because you agreed, but because you received. Here's the uncomfortable part. Even when you recognize what's happening, the pressure doesn't disappear, because the rule isn't about logic. It's about social survival. Your brain treats refusal as a potential relationship cost, so compliance feels like the safer move, even when it's not in your interest. What's the last favor you accepted that quietly limited your options afterward? Reciprocation explains why saying no feels harder after help, but it doesn't explain why people keep saying yes long after the original favor is forgotten. That requires something stronger, something that locks decisions to identity. Idea 3. Commitment and consistency. Why your past decisions start deciding for you. Reciprocation pulls you forward. Commitment keeps you there. Once you take a position, say something publicly, agree to something small, or act in a visible way, your mind starts protecting that decision. Not because it was correct, but because it was yours. From that moment on, future choices are filtered through a new question. What would someone like me do next? This is commitment turning into identity. People think consistency is about integrity. It's not. Psychologically, it's about self-image stability. The mistake is believing you're reevaluating decisions, when in reality, you're just staying aligned with a version of yourself that was formed earlier, often casually. The mind hates contradiction. Once you act in a certain way, backing out later creates internal tension. So instead of asking, is this still the right decision? The mind asks, how do I stay consistent with who I've already shown myself to be? That shift is subtle and extremely powerful. Think about a workplace example. You agree to help on a small task, nothing major. Later, you're asked to take on more responsibility, then more visibility, then ownership. At each step, the request feels reasonable. Not because it is, but because saying no would now contradict the image you've already presented. Reliable, committed team player hours. So you keep going. Not because you chose the endpoint, but because you're staying consistent with the beginning. From the inside, this doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like character. I'm just someone who follows through. I don't back out. This is who I am. That's what makes this principle dangerous. It doesn't force you. It recruits you to enforce it. Which decision are you still defending simply because it's already been made? Reciprocation explains obligation. Commitment explains momentum. But there's another force that operates even when you've made no decision at all. a force that answers uncertainty by outsourcing judgment to the crowd. Idea 4. Social proof. Why uncertainty makes other people persuasive. When you're unsure, you don't look inward, you look around. Social proof is the rule that says, if many people are doing this, it's probably the right thing to do. This shortcut isn't about conformity, it's about efficiency. When the situation is unclear, copying others feels safer than guessing alone, especially when stakes feel high, information is incomplete, time is limited to owed. People think social proof only affects crowds, trends, or weak-minded thinking. It doesn't. In fact, the more complex the decision, the more attractive this shortcut becomes. The mistake is assuming your judgment is independent when it's actually being calibrated by what others appear to believe. Uncertainty creates discomfort. Your brain wants relief, not accuracy. So instead of asking, "What do I think?" it asks, "What do people like me seem to be doing?" That shift replaces analysis with imitation, quietly, automatically. Think about online reviews. You don't read all of them. You scan the rating. 4.5 stars feels safe. 3 stars feels risky. Nothing about the product changed. Only your perception of what others chose. Or think about work. When no one speaks up in a meeting, silence becomes the signal. Not because everyone agrees, but because no one wants to be the first to step outside the invisible consensus. From the inside, this feels smart. Other people already tested this. There's data here. I'm not guessing blindly. And sometimes that's true. But social proof doesn't care why others chose something, only that they did, which means errors, once popular, spread faster than truth. When you're uncertain, whose behavior do you treat as evidence? Social proof explains how decisions spread, but it doesn't explain why specific people influence you more than others. Why one voice carries weight, even when many are present. For that, we need to look at something far more personal. Idea 5. Liking. Why the person matters more than the argument. There are people you listen to before they even finish the sentence. Not because they're right, but because you like them. We are more likely to say yes to people we like. That sounds obvious. But what creates liking isn't deep connection. It's surface-level signals. Similarity, familiarity, complements, shared identity. Once those signals are present, agreement feels natural, not evaluated. Natural. People assume liking is emotional and shallow, so they ignore it. The mistake is believing you can separate the message from the messenger in real time. You usually can't. Because liking doesn't change what you think. It changes how carefully you think. Liking lowers psychological defenses. When someone feels familiar or aligned, your brain categorizes them as safe, and safe sources don't get interrogated. You don't scrutinize every detail. You don't search for hidden costs. You assume goodwill and move faster. Think about a coworker you get along with. Same humor, similar background, easy conversation. When they suggest something in a meeting, it feels reasonable immediately. Now imagine the exact same suggestion from someone you don't like. Suddenly, you want details, evidence, time to think. The idea didn't change. Only the person did. Liking doesn't feel like influence. It feels like chemistry, comfort. That's why it works so well. You don't feel persuaded, you feel aligned. And alignment rarely feels dangerous, even when it quietly moves decisions in one direction. Whose suggestions do you accept before you fully understand them? Liking explains why friendly influence works. But there's another signal that overrides friendliness completely. A signal that doesn't need warmth or similarity, just recognition. Idea 6. Authority. Why symbols override judgment. There are moments when you don't evaluate an idea. You defer. Authority isn't about power. It's about signals, titles, uniforms, credentials, confidence. When those signals are present, your brain shortcuts a longer process and asks a simpler question. Is this person supposed to know? If the answer feels like yes, compliance becomes the default. People think authority only works when someone is actually competent. It doesn't. Authority works when competence is implied. The mistake is believing you're evaluating information when you're actually responding to presentation. From early on, we're conditioned to obey authority. Teachers, doctors, managers, experts. That conditioning doesn't disappear with age. It just becomes quieter. So when authority signals appear, your mind relaxes, not because the information is correct, but because responsibility feels transferred. Think about a meeting. Someone speaks confidently, uses technical language, mentions experience or credentials. No one challenges them, not because everyone agrees, but because questioning them feels risky. You don't want to look ignorant, or disrespectful, or difficult. So the idea moves forward, not tested, not examined, accepted. Authority doesn't feel like pressure, it feels like relief. If the authority is wrong, the fault doesn't feel like yours. That's the trade. Less effort for less control. Which authority signals make you stop verifying? Authority explains why some voices end discussions. But there's one last trigger that doesn't rely on people at all. A trigger that works on time, opportunity, and fear of loss. And once it appears, decisions speed up dramatically. Idea 7. Scarcity. Why urgency shuts down evaluation. Nothing speeds up a decision like the feeling that it might disappear. Scarcity is the rule that says if it's limited, it must be valuable. Time limits, limited spots, final chances, last copies. When availability feels threatened, your brain stops asking, is this good for me? And starts asking, will I regret missing this? People think scarcity works because they want the thing more. That's not accurate. Scarcity works because loss feels heavier than gain. The mistake is believing urgency reflects importance. Often, it reflects nothing more than timing pressure. Your brain treats potential loss as something that must be avoided immediately. So under scarcity, thinking narrows, comparison disappears. Long-term consequences fade. Speed replaces scrutiny. Not because you're impulsive, but because delay feels dangerous. Think about a job offer. You need to decide by tomorrow. Suddenly, questions feel risky. Negotiation feels inappropriate. Saying no feels like throwing something away. The offer didn't change, only the clock did. Or think about buying, only 2 left. Sale ends tonight. You don't evaluate value, you evaluate regret. From the inside, scarcity feels rational. Opportunities don't wait. I can't overthink this. I'll figure it out later. That's the trap. Scarcity doesn't make bad decisions, it makes fast ones. And fast decisions feel clean until you live with them. What have you said yes to, mostly because waiting felt unsafe? The pattern. What keeps repeating? Seen individually, each of these principles feels reasonable, helpful even, but together they form a pattern. Automaticity hands decisions off. Reciprocation creates obligation. Commitment locks identity. Social proof spreads momentum. Liking lowers defenses. Authority ends discussion. Scarcity removes time. None of them require persuasion. They don't argue. They don't convince. They bypass. That's why resisting them feels so hard. Because you're not fighting logic, you're fighting systems designed to save effort under pressure. The real divide. There are 2 kinds of thinkers. Those who assume, if something feels reasonable, it probably is. And those who ask, what shortcut might be running right now? The first group stays efficient, the second keeps control. The cost of ignoring this pattern isn't one bad decision. It's compound compliance. Small yeses, over time, in the same direction. Listening is good, but action is better. As we wrap up, here are the 3 most actionable ideas. You don't need more control. You need fewer automatic decisions. 1. Urgency is a signal, not a command. When something feels urgent, don't decide immediately. Say, I'll get back to you. Let me think about it. I'll decide tomorrow. If the option disappears because you paused, it wasn't designed for judgment. It was designed for speed. Hoshkar 2. Gratitude and agreement are not the same thing. When someone helps you, respond with appreciation, not commitment. Say thank you, then stop. Don't add extra favors, rushed yeses, future promises. Kindness doesn't require repayment with time, money, or leverage. 3. Past decisions don't earn permanent loyalty. Once a week, ask one question. If this showed up today, would I still say yes? If the answer is no, the decision stays only because it hasn't been questioned. Redeciding is not quitting. It's thinking. These aren't defenses. They're filters. They don't stop influence. They stop unnoticed influence. The goal isn't to resist persuasion all the time. That's unrealistic. The real skill is noticing the exact moment a decision stops being deliberate and starts being automatic. Because once you can see the trigger, you get the choice back, quietly, without conflict. Which principle in this video do you see showing up most often in your own life? Say it in the comments. If this video sharpened the way you think, subscribe to The Outlier Minds. This channel isn't about motivation. It's about power, clarity, and decision-making when it actually matters. And if you want to go deeper into how influence, power, and human behavior really work, check out the People Skills Influence and Leadership playlist. Choose your next step. I'll see you in the next video.